a Catholic Mass series, we'll continue our discussion of the Mass's visual and ceremonial aspects with a review of the history, symbolism, and function of priestly and Episcopal vestments. Why does the priest put on special clothing to celebrate the Mass? Is it purely aesthetic and ceremonial, or is there a theological significance? And when did this all start? Did the apostles and early church fathers wear the same things that you see your local priests wear on a Sunday? What was the historic and symbolic development of the cassock, the chasuble, and more? On sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all of these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to, but please do consider a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation. And please consider leaving a rating and a review on the podcast. This will make sure that more people can find these episodes and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. So now let's join Father Ian Palco for episode 31. Why do priests wear vestments? Father Palco, great to have you back again. And can I just say for the record, it is nice to be on the interviewing side of things instead of the interviewee after a couple of weeks. Father Robinson was a harsh interviewer.
Yeah, I to be honest, I've only gotten through about half an hour between the drive down to the convent this morning and the drive back, just putting it on play and listening to it as I was going. Recommended way of people maybe listening to the podcast. Maybe not this one, because we're going to show some pictures. Right, I want to be driving for that one, perhaps. But for this one, there's going to be some visuals for sure. Yeah. Indeed. It was, it did seem like it's interesting to be in the hot seat after a while, isn't it?
It is. I have all new respect for you. I mean, I already had respect for you, but now even more. So, well, anyway, thank you, Father, for joining us. We're going to be talking about vestments for this episode and the next one. The history of vestments, the art of them, the symbolism, the theology behind all of it. So specifically, I guess I'll just ask the basic question before we get started. Why? Why vestments? Why is there a distinctive dress for a priest, or I guess we can start even more generally, any priest, whether Catholic or not, or even pagan? Like, there seems to be always some sort of clothing that a priest will wear for any sort of religious ceremony. Why?
Well, I think overall it's to make some kind of distinction. Maybe worthwhile, since you were talking in the last episode about art, to even mention that this is sort of, yes, there's a side to it that's going to be practical, but we are talking about an art. Textile and design is an art. It's not in the same, obviously, as painting or sculpture. But a good quality textile production investments do have to have some kind of principles to them. And so there is this objective and subjective aspect that, like you were talking about in with regard to art. Just like there's these, you could say there's art is kind of a, finger painting is art, and Play-Doh versus oil painting and sculpture. For textiles, there's a difference there. We have the stuff that we wear every day, the stuff that is for utility. We have those things that are really the fine tailoring, the nice distinct suits that we're going to have there, that we're going to wear. And I think it's the same with regard to vestments, So I hoped in at least this episode, and then the next one, when we talk maybe a bit more practically about things, the colors of vestments and things like that, and the rules and some guides for providing vestments and good quality vestments for a chapel and repair, things like that. Yeah. We also kind of need to be able to look at it from an artistic point, because you're going to have good art, you're going to have bad art, you're going to have good art investments and bad art investments. And it's not just necessarily a question of, well, all of those bizarre looking Novus Ordo vestments that, straight out of 1970. That's not only what we're talking about here. We're going to talk about, even on the traditional side of things, just, not good art there. And it is art. And a lot of that's going to come about, like you were talking about, also violating principles, right? That's the whole kind of modernism idea. Let's just recreate, let's throw away the principles. Let's make it completely subjective. Good people, perhaps, who don't know principles, it's a common hallmark of modern man to not really appreciate what he's lost in understanding these principles. That's what ends up meaning that we're going to, when we discuss vestments, have this issue not only of needing to make a distinction, which is really what it sort of happens with regard to the priest and priestly caste and religious vestments, but we have to see that the reason for this distinction will end up setting up why, for instance, we can use certain things and why we don't use other things.
Yeah.
Aside from it being a fine art, though, it's also a practical art or a useful art. So that's where it's unlike, you would say, painting, unlike sculpture. Here, a vestment, textiles don't need just to be beautiful, but also functional. Something that is highly beautiful sometimes ends up being entirely, dysfunctional. And so you have, for instance, this is where even in the practical level, there's a difference between a woman who sews together a skirt for herself or her daughter versus making a suit. There's that need for certain things to lay certain ways, move certain ways. And oftentimes those who don't have experience with the traditional liturgy don't appreciate the fine lookingness of it, but also the utility. Then, modern times, we farm a lot of this out to mass production in overseas countries by people who have no clue what they're doing, and we're going to create problems. So just to sort of preface your question there with this whole idea of it being an art, and that's one of the reasons we're talking about it in this section of the Mass series, is it ties into not just a practical usage, but it ties into art in more general. And
interestingly, you could also say it's almost, sorry, Father, it's almost like a uniform, right? I mean, police officers wear a specific garb to show that who they are, and so that people can recognize them and see them. And
Indeed.
There's a reason judges wear the robe in the courtroom. I mean, I'm to get a little meta about this, I'm feeling a little bit sheepish because this morning I forgot that we were recording, and I threw on just a cruddy looking polo shirt because I've got some outside stuff to do later. And usually I try to wear something nicer for the pod, but it does tie into the idea of you dress nicer for certain occasions. You have certain uniforms for things that are important, even if I didn't do it today. Sorry.
Well, I mean, this might be casual for the 1930s, but these days that polo shirt is, I remember being in New Zealand. Sometimes we had to try to convince the boys down there that it wasn't the most appropriate thing to, despite the fact that they wanted to make a visit to the Blessed Sacrament, that rugby shorts after, PE wasn't, they should probably change before they went in and visited our Lord. The spirit was good, but maybe the clothing could be a bit better.
Exactly.
That's an important thing to do. We have uniforms for a reason. And you notice when we do have people who have a particular role or dignified in a particular way, a police officer, that uniform is useful. You don't want the police officer having to, not being able to move so he can run after a criminal. But at the same point in time, it should be quite decent. It should show a kind of dignity. If he's just wearing a T-shirt that says police on it, I mean, maybe you'll obey him. But if he's wearing some dress blacks because of some function, you're going to take him a lot more seriously. And I think some of where we'll end up talking about the good and bad vestments too, along these lines, is that there's this modern difficulty with art in general. But consider that there's this decay as far as culture goes. Until the 1970s, for instance, just your average common person wore something that's far more formal than we do in every day these days. That's like I said, polo shirt is that you can go out and golf course this way, but so and maybe today you can even go out in a T-shirt. I don't know, some places, but the T-shirt and shorts, that wasn't something that we did back in the day. And I remember when I was before going to the seminary, before becoming a teacher as an engineer, I was working at a brewery here in town in Kansas City before that. And going in, you would be confronted with this big picture of the old Mule Block Brewery. And there were these two men who were standing over the kettle looking down. And while they're wearing a nice leather apron that holds back the tie, you can see the collared shirt, the rolled up sleeves. Yeah. You can imagine that, they weren't wearing dress pants, but they were wearing something that we would probably look to see as like khakis or something like that today. And that was workwear in the day. Yeah. I'm not suggesting that we need to go back to that necessarily, but there was this different degree between all of these things. There was morning attire for formal things. Semi-formal was the black lounge suit and the black tie. Today it's like black tie. That's semi-formal. A business suit was informal wear, and then you had casual attire and things. So many think a suit these days is, such formal attire. I put on a suit. But for the laity, this is like a suit, at least a shirt and tie is really kind of minimum standard for coming to Mass. So much more so for the priest, who's supposed to be the representative of Christ behind all of this, should have the highest quality kind of thing that he's showing some kind of symbolism there. And you notice as the liturgy gets devalued, as the idea of it being more of a gathering rather than the sacrifice of Christ enters in, now we just kind of play around. Now the vestments kind of, who cares? It's just this, it's this error of convenience, as it were, over beauty, this utilitarianism in art, sort of like your definition, right? The Frank Lloyd Wright utilitarian view of things versus beauty, really the Thomistic idea behind things of this elevating the soul, being a kind of adoration. Even back in the early days, there was this distinction. I think that's one mistake that we kind of make, though. It's easy for us 2,000 years after the founding of the church to look back and try to apply what we understand now or understand it should be, and look back and try to see some kind of Baroque liturgy that St. Peter himself was celebrating. Right? That's probably not how things were. I mean, no. Even your 3rd century, fish drawn on the wall, it isn't something that we would probably appreciate as good Christian art these days. Right. In the day it was, et cetera. And that's sort of it. The clerical vestments that we have are going to develop out of just the common wear of the time, just as the art, specifically Christian art, began as something that was just civil art, not pagan necessarily, but symbols and various other things were borrowed and then enhanced and beautified. And then they became more distinct as the time went along, as other fashions, for instance, changed. So early along, you could say that the church wasn't highly directive in her liturgical rules. There wasn't some universal practice, especially with vestments. There's also this need for Christians in the early days where there were persecutions. Again, a little mistake historically here to think that there are these persecutions going on all the time, right? Everywhere, in every place, throughout the entire Roman world, Christians were being persecuted for 300 years. No, actually, at certain times there was peace and the church was accepted as a burial society. But there was always this back and forth, this chance of persecution. And so the last thing you wanted to do was create this massive storehouse of particular, very high value vestments that could easily be taken. Last thing you were going to do is go out into the public in wear that you very clearly looked like you were different than everybody else. Yep. And yet at the same point in time, they were making distinctions in the liturgy, right? So we could sort of say here, the historically speaking, the development of vestments really doesn't happen until Christianity has its freedom after the Edict of Milan. So 313 and after, now you're going to start seeing distinctive vestments really develop. Before that, you're going to see, even if we apply a certain iconography, we'll see, 1st century saints dressed in a particular way. They probably weren't dressed that way. That's probably an application for afterward. But you will see a lot of these things develop, but really not until about the 4th century. And then you will see that they develop more or less by keeping civil garments that are quite nice, the highest quality civil garments. As fashions change, these end up becoming the regular religious garments themselves.
Okay. So were there any sort of restrictions or guidelines? I mean, obviously, a priest celebrating Mass would probably wear something that was nicer than your everyday tunic or whatever he was going to be wearing. But did the church, the church had some other important things to do, like, bash down heresies and things like that in the early days. Yeah. But are there any indications that, hey, you should wear something like this from those times?
Yeah. So we read so we know certain things about how in the early church, these things were done simply by certain writings. We may see St. Lawrence pictured in a Gothic dalmatic. But no, in the 4th century, he was martyred in the 3rd century. But in the 4th century, you have the canons of Hippolytus. So these are a variety of different rules. Hippolytus was a saint, but he was also an anti-pope. There's a whole history there. And interestingly enough, one of his supposed canons is borrowed for the Novus Ordo Mass. It's not really his, but that's then entirely different. I'll let somebody who knows a bit more about that talk about that at that point in time. But no, some of those canons direct the priests to gather around with the priests and the bishop. They're just supposed to be wearing the nicest white, clean clothes, better than that which the faithful wear. So we do see rules, but the rules aren't, okay, well, you must wear this type of garment and it will be this way and it's constructed that way. It's wear the nice stuff and be better than the faithful around you. Which does suggest that perhaps that wasn't always happening.
Yeah, fair enough.
But
so when do we start to see more distinctive wear other than wear white, wear some nicer clothes? When do we start to see some differentiation?
Yeah, so the secular garments, which if you look at St. Cyprian's martyrdom, Eusebius talks about this. He's wearing a tunic, he's wearing an under tunic, a tunic, a mantle, like a cope, a jacket, common secular garments. But in really about the 6th century or so, a truly distinctive clerical wear comes about. St. Gregory the Great is going to talk about substituting certain things. So it seems like it's slightly before then, where they're obviously having some kind of clerical vestments. But the tunic starts going out of fashion at that point in time. And now people are wearing other things, oftentimes divided garments, pants-like things. And so now the tunic ends up being something that is kind of just the church is using, or the church in particular is using the nicer of these things. And so the tunic now becomes something that is used more frequently in the church. Okay. You'll have the dalmatic, which is from Dalmatia, which is where you get the name from. It actually became fashionable in the 2nd century and then falls out of fashion later. So it's adopted for the deacon in the church as a particularly diaconal garment, but it falls out of fashion and now it's kept in the church. And this is about in the 6th century as well, where the fashions start changing. And we have, like, for instance, the chasuble. The chasuble was originally sort of just like a poncho that you would wear over yourself. It was the slave's garment, in fact. Historically, if you look around, obviously there's other implications to this, but look at what you would see historically in, say, Mexico, like back in the day, the guy out in the horse in his poncho. Imagine if you went into Mexico City, you wouldn't see people who were dressed in ponchos, except for maybe the poorer people. Same kind of thing was going on back in Rome. It was a slave's garment. It was a low class garment. This was very simple, piece of fabric you throw over your head with a hole in it. Yeah. But it became very fashionable in the 3rd century. And the nobility would wear it because now you had more access to horses and riding and things like this. And so it was a bit, wearing a tunic and trying to adjust it around when you're sitting on something. So yeah, not as easy. So this poncho-like garment then again falls out of fashion, but is kept in the church. And that's where we get the chasuble from. So even so, remember, even since the 4th century, we're being instructed that while the clergy wear civil wear, as it were, it's a distinctive kind of civil wear. So there's always something that's higher, that's more noble, something that will naturally lead itself to artistic designs, and especially when it comes to the liturgy. But it's not until this sort of after the late 4th century that you really do get distinctive wear for the clergy. For example, the omophorion, which turns into the Latin, the pallium, which is that garment that a bishop will wear if he's an archbishop or the Pope himself. That it's this band that goes around and has this little thing that comes down the front. It's used by Eastern bishops and the Pope. It was at the time. That begins developing at that point in time. The orarion, which becomes the stole, it's used by civil authorities who are exercising authority. It's borrowed by the church for that same purpose. But we would say, despite the fact that there's all these little changes here and there, just like the liturgy itself is developing, the garments that are being used are developing. And in the Roman Church, it's about the 9th century or so where their vestments are more or less settled upon. There's some changes during the Middle Ages, but the vestments that are used by the Roman clergy more or less are settled in that early Middle Ages period.
Okay.
And there's a good reason for that. Charlemagne, right? So if, the 800s, early 9th century, the Pope is more and more becoming sort of the substitute for the Roman emperor. Right? Mm-hmm. In Rome, there is no, after the fall of the Roman Empire, you have borrowed these very imperial-like garments for bishops, especially the Pope. And then the clergy started adopting some of those too in imitation of the Pope. And then you have Charlemagne, who during his reign starts taking the Roman liturgy and imposing it upon his realm.
Right.
And so you start getting where people were doing all kinds of different things. Now there's a bit more uniformity under Charlemagne because we're taking what apparently the Pope was doing, debatable, but taking what the Pope is doing, and now we're doing it in our realm here. And of course, it's an imitation of the old empire. And for the Holy Roman Emperor, that makes some sense.
Interesting. So at this time, he's going to start to dictate, and he has a huge role also in the liturgy itself, mm-hmm. making sure that the Roman liturgy is what is being said in his kingdom. But he's also going to apply that to the attire, to the garb, to the vestments.
Right. Or at least it's where the influence, if not I don't know of any decrees where he's insisting on this, but the very fact of him taking the Roman liturgy and trying to make it common in his realm means that the things that the Romans are doing will end up becoming somewhat common in his realm as well. Okay. And naturally speaking, at that point in time, too, you're going to start seeing distinctions between East and West. So most of these vestments had a very simple origin and form. The phalonion, which is used by Eastern priests, and the chasuble are actually the same poncho-like vestment, but there's different forms that start developing at this point in time. You'll notice if you go to most of the Society of St. Pius X's masses that it's more common, though it's not forbidden, to see not the sort of more flowing Gothic-like chasuble, though I tend to like those, but the quote unquote Roman vestments, that's a bit of a misnomer itself, but Roman vestments tend to be what you see. But you'll notice that how do these things relate? Well, all it is the poncho. Well, it's kind of hard to move your arms around. And so you start cutting away fabric to make it easier.
Sure.
In the East, they cut out the front. And so if you go to a Byzantine rite, you'll tend to see that there's like a band around the front, but then a long back to it, where long down the sides, but your arms are free in the front, sort of like our modern cope. And even some of the phalonion that you'll see in the East are basically copes without a hood. They're effectively there's a little chain here. Otherwise, they're more or less the same. Whereas we started cutting off the sleeves. We started cutting the arms back little by little, where the front and the back remained. And so this is where you get distinctions between East and West, this poncho-like garment.
That's fascinating.
So I guess, you asked a question before, and I've been sort of beating around the bush answering it, but why wear vestments? So there's some historical development here, yes, and that I tend to get distracted on these things. So very interesting, and I can nerd out for a little while. But we could say it's in order to make the liturgical service a distinct and ceremonial act, just like you would wear your finest garb, or an officer would dress up in his way. And that requires certain items and certain clothing, certain things that are ceremonial and that you use. The priest has received some of Christ's power, so he's been clothed, as it were, in the priesthood of Christ. And so you want to symbolize that in a certain way by making him and putting on to him certain robes that symbolize that, that signify that, and help the faithful see that distinction, not just that he's raised above us, but he's raised above us and he has this special way of being raised above us. And of course, then we can't exclude there to add beauty to the liturgy. That there is that artistic aspect, and that cannot be forgotten. It's not just utilitarian. It's not just a practical division. We should be using the highest quality items and the kinds of dress, just like we would for any formal occasion, and you use the best kind of dress. Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. I'm sorry for jumping the gun with that question earlier.
No, that's no. It was a good first question, and I just there's a few things we need to establish first. I think on the art points perspective, but no, coming back around to that whole idea, no, really important. I think.
So you said that there were utilitarian reasons for these, and you mentioned that some of the that poncho like garb is going to be cut away and it's going to be easier to use in certain places, but there's also going to be some sort of symbolism, or at least symbolism that's going to be applied to the vestments. And I guess that's the next place we'll look.
Yeah, there is. And I think that's a good way of putting it. The symbolism is applied. So remember, the early liturgy really didn't have these distinctive vestments, except that it was kind of nicer. That's one of the dangers that we can, of a kind of antiquarianism. We can easily look backwards. This was a complaint about the liturgical movement in a lot of ways. They looked back. Oh, hey, before they received communion in the hand, not like we did now, not in that way. And it's very
better.
different.
They did it, so we got to do it. Yeah,
we got to do it. Yeah, it was lost. They received under both kinds. Yeah, the practicality of that is a mess. And if you've ever seen it in the Eastern Church, there's a reason that their liturgies take so long. We want to receive, we want to be out of there in 20 minutes, and we want to receive under both kinds. Yeah, that's not happening, just practically speaking. But there is this kind of antiquarianism where we can apply to the past some kind of symbolism that really doesn't exist. There's I sort of have to call it out. I wrote an article. I mentioned this in the Angelus a while back. Frequently in traditional circles, you'll see this book, How Christ Said the First Mass. Oh, yeah. What I find weird about the book is, despite the fact that this is a priest who claims to be Catholic, when writing on liturgical subjects and writing on things in history and things like that, all of these books needed imprimaturs. His doesn't have it, which is a bit odd. I'm not sure that that's because he didn't try for it. I don't know the history of that. And he's not saying theologically incorrect things, just historically inaccurate things. And you can see that he's trying to establish basically for the Protestants, no, this baroque liturgy that you were objecting to and you all rebelled from, that was how Christ did. And it's from the temple. It was always done this way. He writes at one point in time, as I recall, a few writers trace clerical robes and vestments to their origin in the temple and Passover. Because they didn't start from there, as we've seen, right? They started from garments that people were wearing in the Greco-Roman world. They're not borrowed from the temple at all. In fact, what is the Mass? It isn't a temple service. It's the Passover. The Passover was a service that was done in the family. It was a familiar service, to which, of course, there is this aspect of a temple aspect in the sacrifice of the lamb, the spreading of the blood. There certainly is that. But it's not as if it's, this was done in the temple. We're just taking it and Christianizing it, and there we go. Like, no. So he says, for instance, the alb is the seamless garment that the temple priest would wear. It's the tunic. It's the Greco-Roman tunic. It's very clearly that. The historical development is very easy to trace to that. The chasuble is this poncho, but he will say it's Elias's prophetic robe. Like, so we can, the danger here, of course, is to apply a symbolism that really doesn't exist and then insist on something that flows from that and make conclusions from that. We don't want to have a contrived symbolism, but we want to be able to look at where these things really do have that symbolism. And it's I think the Roman spirit, the Romanitas, as it were, for the liturgy, isn't that we should be looking for symbolism. Rather, we should see where there is some utility there, because that's how the Romans really were. And if there is symbolism that we apply after the fact to something, great. If it helps us, wonderful. But not to see that as the actual symbolism, not to see that it must be this way because I think that this represents this. If we see that image, wonderful. But that's not what the church is trying to communicate by that necessarily. It doesn't mean it's not a one-to-one comparison there. And that's, I think, really important to note here. There is symbolism, and we'll talk about some of those symbolic aspects of things. But a lot of that's applied. A lot of that's not from the original. It wasn't that way. It's applied. And that's the whole Roman spirit, right? Anything that happens at the Mass, there's a reason for it. It's not just symbolic. There's a practical reason for it. Why the Roman Rite is by far the shortest of the Catholic rites and its ceremonies, and why we can identify if that server goes over and genuflects, he's doing that for a reason. And if he's not doing that for a reason, he's wrong.
Yeah.
Right. As a priest, sometimes it's very frustrating. You're trying to recollect and you see the server who randomly goes from the credence table past where he's supposed to kneel on the one side, genuflects in the center just to go back over. Like,
what are you doing?
Why? It's distracting at that point in time. And that's where a lot of the symbolism can be distracting from the point that the church is trying to make by giving us these grand arts that vestments are. Yeah. The vestments began as modifications of the highest quality stuff. And now then they start getting symbolism. The maniple, for instance, we're talking about the maniple of that is worn around the arm was originally just sweat towel. It's even called a sudarium in certain language. You take this thing and then you wipe your face with it because you're getting kind of hot in all these layers and all this work that you're doing and for hours and hours in these Vesper ceremonies and these vigils. Right? Yeah. It makes some sense. Now it starts getting decorated and it starts, taking on this idea of it being the sort of the yoke of Christ or a burden to carry because it kind of weighs your arm down a little bit. Wonderful. If you can see that, you can get something out of that. Wonderful. But that's not why it's on your arm. Right. Not at least why it originally was there. And so we're going to mention symbolism. I don't want to denigrate the idea of symbolism, but what we're doing here is oftentimes after the fact, seeing in something where we can make a comparison, right? Oh, that reminds me of this thing. Not that the church instituted this garment to symbolize this. Right. We have to make that distinction, I think, very early along.
Yep, that makes sense. So then let's look at the various vestments. And there are, I guess we can make a distinction between, there's a lot of cloth used in the liturgy. There's the chalice veil, there's the finger towel for the lavabo, there's the vestments that you're wearing. So are we going to talk about all of those things? Or are we going to talk about just what you're wearing?
Well, I think if we wanted to be really thorough, we're going to have a book-like material and we would have like an entire series dedicated to all of these things. It's not what we were intending by the Mass series, just to have Father Palco talk about vestments for 60 episodes or something like that. And I actually have a mission to take care of, so I don't have the time to do those kinds of things. But
sure.
No, we're going to have to divide it up and we're just going to, I think we should just, sort of gloss over we explain basically these things. And then maybe some rules about them. And if we're going to divide them up correctly, I think we could make a threefold distinction here. We could first talk about what we'll call sacred vestments. Those are the things that the clergy will wear at Mass or wear themselves at various liturgical ceremonies. So those are the sacred vestments.
Okay. We
could then say there's going to be another class. I don't know that the church would call them this, but we could call them like the altar vestments. Okay. And I use vestments because here certain things were associated with the altar or at the altar are being clothed, as it were. It's not just something you use. It's actually something that is a kind of covering, a clothing. And then we could talk about the altar linens. And those are the things that are used during the Mass or other ceremonies that are put upon the altar or used around the altar, typically made of linen, hence altar linens, like the corporal, like the purificator, etc. So I just to organize it a bit, so we're talking about this, maybe that's the best way of making that distinction is to say we're going to talk about three different things. First, the sacred vestments, what a priest or clergy wear. The altar vestments, what is put upon the altar to decorate it. And then the altar linens, those things that are used mostly in connection with the Mass.
Okay. So let's start then with the sacred vestments. Okay. Let's start with, I guess, what you're wearing right now, Father, the cassock.
Yeah, not properly, I would say, a sacred vestment, sort of maybe a preliminary kind of thing. This is the standard habit of a cleric in the Roman Rite.
Okay.
The Latin name is the vestis talaris, which means ankle length robe. And it was the under tunic from before, just a black color of that you would put under the toga or the himasion, which is the Greco-Roman kind of version of that. You'd have the toga, but then you'd have the chiton or the under tunic that was basically just your undergarment, as it were, but not in the sense of we would understand that today. You would have other things underneath. It was the lower layer that went all the way down to the ankles. And the black color being particularly distinctive, original civil garb would have been white linen or sort of white, off-white color. And so this separation from civil life is shown by having it be an alternate color. Black, a good symbol, though again applied, of sort of a separation, a kind of death to normal civil life and a raising up to a new life, sort of a death to self. But then again, I'm sure many people have seen white cassocks before, not just the Pope's particular one called the Simar or Zimar. That's a special kind of cassock that he wears that's a little different. But this white cassock that perhaps even you'll see a society priest wear at times. Right. I remember back over when I was assigned in New Zealand. It's a missionary country, despite the fact that its weather is far more temperate than Arizona or Kansas City. Right. I think the coldest I ever felt down there was a few degrees below freezing. And the hottest I've ever felt was maybe a heat wave where it got up to 83, 84 in Fahrenheit. Oh, wow. It was, beautiful weather all year long, very wet. So that cold feels really awful.
Yeah.
So there's not really a tropical nature to it. Even in the very far north, it gets a little humid, a little tropical, two days. Mm-hmm. But there's not a need to wear the white cassock. And yet that's before the Second Vatican Council. That's what people wore, at least during the summer. Oddly, they would switch back and forth between the black and the white there. So it's not really hot in any real sense. But in missionary countries, the white cassock was approved because most of them were tropical. So you'll see some of our society priests in South America, in the various islands and the missions in Africa. Often they'll wear white. You'll see pictures of Archbishop Lefebvre in his white garb when he was a missionary priest down in Africa. So this white cassock is sometimes used. And there are also various other cassocks, different colors that have some meaning to them. So prelates, for instance, you may have seen bishops wear, one of our bishops comes around to do confirmations and he walks in this like magenta cassock for mass, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that a bishop wears. That's his choir cassock. So cassocks have sort of two different levels from Pius IX, who set these different things up. There's the house cassock, and then there's the choir cassock. For a priest, it's the same. It's black no matter what. For a bishop, you'll notice sometimes he might wear a black with like a color along the piping or around the buttons. Okay, that's his house cassock. That's actually not meant for liturgical use, though sometimes for private masses he will. Where you'll see it for ordinations and various bigger ceremonies. He'll come in and he'll wear the choir cassock, which is all that amaranth color, that's the kind of special scarlet, almost magenta color. For a cardinal, you've probably seen pictures of cardinals wearing red, and then the Pope white. The Pope's white actually is something that came about because of St. Pius V, who was a Dominican who kept his habit, which is white. So before that, the Pope would wear red, and that's going to come up later because when the Pope, say, dies and there's a funeral for the Pope, traditionally it wasn't in black, it was in red because that's the Pope's color. So interesting there. Now, the servers, too, wear this because in imitation of the clergy, right? So you'll see a server wear a cassock. Servers' cassocks are meant to be black. Sometimes you'll see red or other colors for prelates. Not really meant for the servers. That's not traditional. That's a 19th century French invention. Where you'll still see it these days. You'll see them bring in little young boys, 5, 6, 7 years old, who they can't seem to, it's like herding cats at that point in time, all dressed up like little cardinals. I have no idea why. The French love that kind of pageantry. You'll go to something and they'll have, the traditional wear of the soldier who at this point in time with its honor guard, et cetera. Laymen substitute for a minor order when they're serving. acolyte. They're not substituting for cardinals. So black is the appropriate color there. There is an exception to that. At a pontifical mass, an MC could use, I don't suggest he does because it looks a little pretentious, could use the same color as the bishop. And in St. Peter's Basilica, in fact, that same Roman purple or amaranth or sort of a magenta color was permitted to the servers, the boys who were attending the minor seminary there and serving the masses at St. Peter's. But that's a privilege. Otherwise, acolytes wear black. So, okay. But that's our garment. Sometimes you'll see priests in clerical suit. That was commonly done in the United States and in England. What you see these days as a clerical suit is not what was typically worn back. The Council of Baltimore, for instance, wants us to have a frock coat, which is the morning wear, which goes down to like the back of your knees. Sometimes you'll see like the conductor at a symphony, he's wearing a frock coat. It goes all the way down, right? That's historically what a priest would wear outside of his rectory when he would go around. He would wear that plus a top hat. I mean, I like top hats, so I don't have one. So maybe I'll get a frock coat and a top hat at some point in time. But I think that would be a little pretentious. So
yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where you can, should you?
Right. Yeah. That's something to be mentioned when we talk about these vestments too. Is sometimes, yes, okay, a cardinal, for instance, historically would have this long train that would. Should we? I mean, or does that just make people who are maybe looking at the traditional mass and saying, this is beautiful, and then what the heck are you doing? Like, so society has moved maybe in a wrong direction, but that doesn't mean we necessarily need to go back to, 1800s.
Right.
In any case. So that's the cassock. Properly speaking, the sacred vestments really begin with the amice. And I've thrown some pictures in there that we can put up there. I'm sorry you're going to have to look at me again, but that's the only priest who was available for these pictures. So
it's all right.
Tripod and a 10-second timer and running around. So I've tried.
Thank you for doing that.
I think I've done a pretty good job of putting myself more or less in the same place each time. Okay. We can see if you flip back and forth and I move around a little bit, that's why it's a little squirrely. So
fair enough. It'll just be like an old timey movie, just flipping back and forth.
There you go. So the amice is this square piece of linen. A proper Roman form really should be about 30 inches square. So it goes down the back quite a ways. Sometimes we'll find these things are quite narrow, and it's on albs that you put over top of them that don't, the front may come down a ways. It's not tied around the neck. Sometimes you have to kind of cover over it and shift it around. So it's better that it's bigger. It's going to have about 3 foot of twill tape ribbons on either of the corners in the front and a cross in the center. And it has to be made of linen. This is a really big problem you'll find in even some of our sacristies is you'll find like a poly cotton or a cotton thing. It's forbidden by the rubrics. It's not allowed to be done, but it's still oftentimes neglected. It should be linen. And we put it on... We put it over top of our head, and then we shift it down to our neck, and we tie it around, and then we stuff it in. It first is given at the subdiaconate by the bishop. And when the bishop vests the subdeacon in this amice, he says that it symbolizes the discipline of the voice. That's in the rite of ordination of a subdeacon. It's kind of unclear what he means there. But if you look at some of the earlier versions of the amice, the apparelled amice in particular, they sort of look like a scarf. So they kind of go around the neck even more, even up perhaps in a cover part of the face as well. And, some of the older pictures of St. Thomas Becket or something like that, you'll oftentimes see this big band of things that come around that come off the amice. So you can see perhaps there that it kind of muffled the voice or a symbolism of sort of being when preaching or when speaking about things of being disciplined in that. So originally it wasn't tucked into the neck at all. It actually would form this kind of hood that would go over. And monks these days still do that. Whereas we'll talk about later, the beretta is used as a covering for a priest who is not a monk. Typically, this was what the amice was used for before. It'd be pulled up when you would process in, and then you'd put it down for a little while. And so today, when we put it on, we're instructed by the rubrics first to set it on top of our head as if it were a hood, and then we slide it down and tie it around. The prayer that we say, for instance, when we vest in this, talks about putting on the helmet of salvation. So if it just goes around our neck, it's not much of a helmet. I wouldn't want to go into battle with that kind of. I'm not sure I want to go into battle, particularly speaking, with just a piece of linen cloth around me. But
yeah,
in any case, and it's always worn with the alb. So we never wear it outside of wearing an alb, and we never wear the alb without the amice. There is one exception to that in the European usage, which is more common in the society. An assistant deacon at a pontifical mass or the assistant priest at mass, so vested in cope helping the bishop or a first newly ordained priest, will wear the amice if he's wearing a surplice underneath. In the U.S. custom, it was an alb that he would wear. In the European custom, he would wear his surplice, but he would put the amice over top of the surplice, which actually harkens back to a time where the amice was used by a cleric when he would vest he would put over the surplice, and then he would put on the alb over the surplice. So he would layer up, as it were, the whole way, which if that would get kind of hot, I think. So
a little bit. A little bit. But these are also...
So that's the amice. And like I said, the amice always goes with the alb.
These are also mostly in northern climates and old medieval, cathedrals, churches, and those get chilly. So
they get chilly. I mean, there are rubrics. I don't know what I've never been in a case. Well, maybe once where I was saying mass outside, but I still think it was cold. And I've joked sometimes here at St. Vincent's, our heat went out one day and it got down to about 42 in the church one morning. And it was cold. We didn't have any pipes freeze or anything, but there is a rubric for what happens or what you're supposed to do if the precious blood freezes. So it was thought about, and the correct thing to do is to get some boiling water and you put the chalice itself in there and it should conduct the heat up and melt the precious blood.
Interesting.
You can imagine these things were not meant for the Roman summers. Were not meant for Arizona, put it that way.
Exactly.
So some development is not necessarily a bad thing. I would point out that sometimes people linen comes in different weights, so it can be a very light linen. But linen itself and a lot of those natural fabrics, like for my cassock, for instance, this one isn't, but oftentimes are made of wool. And everyone might think, wow, that must be so hot in the summer. Natural fabrics breathe, whereas polyester oftentimes is like wearing a trash bag. And that's not comfortable.
No.
Yes, it might be lighter. It might be nicer at sometimes. But that's one reason to not just the symbolism and the rules of the church. That's another reason to use some of these natural fabrics like linen. So.
Yeah. All right. So the amice and then the alb. That's next.
The alb. Yep. So the alb is this full length tunic, and that's where it developed from. It covers our streetwear entirely. And the idea is that a priest, when he's going to say mass, the only things that should be showing are the things that he needs for the service of the altar. He needs his voice, he needs his eyes, he needs his mouth, and he needs his hands. But the rest of it all should be covered. And so the alb is this way of taking us from the death to self to the new man. So we put on this alb, this tunic. It can be square necked, or it can be round necked, or it can be tied up, cinched up around the neck. There's different forms, and none of them are prescribed. But it covers the whole body, and it's of linen. It should be of linen. Sometimes you'll find blends here. It's not entirely forbidden, but it's more or less to be used only when you can't get good linen. And I don't think that's a problem these days. Yes, that means creases. Yes, that means other things, but that's why you need people taking care of vestments and not just thinking that we can buy these things and just leave them in a closet somewhere.
Yeah.
So it's used by anyone who is in sacred vestments. So if you're going to put on any kind of other sacred vestment, you're going to put that on. And like I said, it's always with the amice underneath of it. And we'll see it's always with the cincture as well. That's the next thing we'll talk about. But you'll notice this alb also being used by servers, so the minor ministers or the inferior ministers at Mass, and various other things in monastic circles. So monastics tend to wear albs for everything and don't use the surplice except for very rare occasions. So
okay.
Yeah.
So then the surplice is essentially developed as a shorter version of the alb.
It is, yeah. It's meant to be that. Yeah. So the surplice is there. Just to mention on here, because the surplice and the alb will both be this. You can trim them out with lace. Lace shouldn't be used during a penitential time. You'll see in the surplice that I have there. You'll see the alb that I had there had a little band of lace on the bottom. That's an appropriate amount, I think. Sometimes you'll get more on big feast days. That's fine. It just don't let it come too high up. It becomes very impractical and it can tear very easily at that point. Mm-hmm. You can also put apparels and various other colors and things like that on there. In any case, yeah, so the surplice, this is developed, like you said there, from the alb. So it's just basically a shorter, wider form of the tunic. And the alb will have tight-fitting sleeves, but if the picture comes up correctly, you'll see that the surplice instead has a much wider sleeves, at least at the bottom. You don't want them too wide, but they do want to have a width to them. They shouldn't be tight around there. The rochet that we'll talk about next has tight-fitting sleeves, and this is the main distinction between them. Okay. Notice in that picture of the surplice, though, where that sits. So the neck is fairly close to the actual neck itself. It's not this big wide thing. Sometimes you'll find surplices that are very wide necked, and they kind of slip off servers' shoulders very easily. But notice where it falls. It's not a t-shirt.
Yep. Sometimes
this is another pet peeve of mine. You'll see the server, especially little young boys, come in to serve Mass, and they pick a cassock. Oftentimes, it looks like they're going to be treading through the stream with the cassock on. And then they pick a surplice that more or less comes down to their waist. It's like a t-shirt. Sometimes they do that simply because the necks are too wide. So maybe it's better to, instead of just buying one where the necks are terribly wide, get some made that are properly sized. But really, it should come down to like mid-thigh level or even down to the knees. So that's my surplice from the seminary that I'm wearing there. And if you'll look at seminarians wearing them, you're not going to see seminarians, unless they're at Mass with some lace on or something like that, wearing anything shorter than that. It shouldn't be very short. And again, there can be some lace on the edges here, but that really should just be for festive days and occasions, usually restricted to the higher clergy, just for the humility's sake of there and the propriety. The materials that it's made of actually are not regulated. Linen is good, just like an amice, but cotton and other blended fabrics here can be used. And oftentimes, since the surplice does need to be cared for a little bit more, a little blend of cotton can make it can prevent some wrinkles in it. So, so that's the surplice is allowed there, especially if linen's difficult to obtain or keep up. And that surplice is given to the cleric when he is tonsured. And he's told, "May the Lord clothe thee with the new man who is created in righteousness and true holiness after the image of God." So it's a symbol of this new man. At least the church puts on us that symbolism. So remember, we were talking about symbolism. The church herself has applied this symbolism, even if that's not the original reason. So the church does have an interest in directing this one here. So, and a priest is going to wear that when he's baptizing, blessing items here in confessions. Otherwise, it's just used by clerics when they're in choir or they're attending Mass or serving Mass when they're not wearing something else that's appropriate to their order. So, so that's the surplice.
Okay. And then the rochet. You said this is similar, but a couple different. Yeah.
And sometimes it'll be mistaken for a surplice. So a rochet is similar to a surplice. You notice in form it's very similar, except look at the arms. They're very tight down there, and the tie around the neck. That's almost universal that they're tied around the neck. Though you do sometimes find some square-necked ones, so This doesn't have to be tied. It usually is. Notice that there's a lot of lace on it. And this is very typical because prelates will wear it. Even sometimes in penitential times, though it's usually a little bit less. It's supposed to be restricted to canons and prelates. It's sort of customarily used by a lot of different people. And sometimes just used by priests as a surplice. It's more appropriate that it's reserved for canons or who are monsignors, for instance, or prelates when they're using other garments. So it's kind of an alb in shorter form again, and it's really, I would say it's because it's reserved for prelates, it's really not appropriate for a layman serving at the altar, because even it's questionable for just an average priest, so much more so for the layman.
Sure.
So,
can we pause just for a second, Father?
Sure.
Prelate is a bishop? Another word for bishop?
Is, well, so a prelate is a bishop, but also there are minor prelates. So, for example, somebody who has been appointed a chaplain of His Holiness, oftentimes in a diocese, you'll find like Monsignor this or Monsignor that. In the society we have, for instance, Monsignor Burns, who takes care of, is down in Atlanta right now. So he was a priest who came over to us from the diocese, I believe, of New York. I'm not Archdiocese of New York, but because he had served in a role and done a lot of work with education, he was given a special title and appointed, I believe, a chaplain of His Holiness, which comes with a certain title, Monsignor. I don't think Pope Francis has done that much anymore, but you can have these prelates who get some kind of dignity, but they're not yet a bishop. So it's sort of a halfway point. It's a priest who's given a special title or dignity, but he's not consecrated a bishop.
And then a canon is?
A canon is somebody who is at a cathedral as the clergy for that cathedral, who is bound sort of like the monks of St. Augustine to sing the office at the cathedral. So, for instance, they're going to come and they're going to sing all of the divine office at the cathedral. And they're the staff of the cathedral, but that's their particular role. They're associated there. And they're given this title of canon because for that role in particular. So a canon is somebody who is associated with a particular cathedral in a diocese, and then he's given certain extra privileges because of that role that he has. But he's also then bound to do certain functions for that cathedral, for instance.
Okay. So like the canons of St. John Cantius in Chicago.
Correct.
Similar.
Yeah. So that they're the canons regular. So there's also this other group too that is, so you have, it started out in the cathedrals, but then you had these groups that would become religious of certain types. They're a religious order. They're associated with a particular church with a particular religious rule, I believe the Augustinian rule. And they follow that and they sing the office as well. So they're sort of associated in a certain way with the cathedral, but not the cathedral directly. Okay. So
that makes sense.
Development of various things in the church. So
sure. Thanks for the side note.
No worries.
And then, all right. So back to the alb. So you've put on the amice and then the alb, and then you have the cincture.
The cincture, always worn with an alb. The alb is never worn without it, and the alb is always worn with it. And the cincture is never worn aside from wearing the alb. So you never put the cincture around a surplice or a rochet. They go together. It can be made of any suitable material. It's, as you can see, a cord, and sometimes it's colored. Usually it's white, but it can be colored in any liturgical color. Although it's not appropriate to have it in black. And there's a good reason for that. Because as we say in the prayer, gird me, O Lord, with the girdle of purity. If we have a black stained girdle, that's maybe not the symbolism that we're going for there.
Sure.
So you'll be able to find these and purchase them. And a lot of chapels, I refuse to use them. Technically, they're not against the rubrics, but the symbolism is completely lost on these things. And like I said, symbolism isn't not important. We don't want to poo-poo symbolism or anything like that. But you don't want to give the wrong symbolism with that.
Sure.
It's been a particular liturgical vestment since the 9th century, but though it's been used in the liturgy at certain points in time since really the earliest days of the church.
Okay. And again, sort of a practical reason here. I mean, I know there's a symbolic reason, gird me with chastity, but there's also a practical reason of it just kind of helps hold everything together and right? Or
yeah, And later along, as you'll see, when we start putting on other vestments, like the priest's stole, it holds the stole, which is hanging down in front, from basically disassembling itself as you move around.
Okay.
So yeah,
got it.
All right. So we have the maniple now. And the maniple is the first of these specifically, I could say, sacred vestments that's reserved to those in major orders. By major orders, I mean the subdeacon, the deacon, and the priest. And I guess you could say the bishop there too, but the bishop is a kind of priest. So the three highest sacred orders, subdeacon, deacon, and priest, use the maniple. So this is first given at the ordination to the subdiaconate. And as you can see, it's a doubled band of fabric that's worn over the left forearm, always the left. And if you were to measure it in total, it's about 3 feet in total, maybe a little bit more in some cases. Like the Gothic version of this tends to be a lot longer, so it might be as many as perhaps 5 feet long or 4 feet long. And it's about 3 to 4 inches wide overall. That can vary a little bit. Some are thinner and then they spread out a little bit, but it's about that. That's just kind of general idea of what size it is. It's fastened on the one of the sides. So it's going to be the one that's closest to like the middle of the body or the front of the hand. It's going to be pinned there. It's going to have a little piece of trim that kind of holds it together, just a stitch. And that's so it lays like you saw in the picture there. It lays kind of flat against the body when your hands are folded. If it's bound on both sides, it will lay correctly there, but then it will sort of move around badly. If it's not bound at all, it kind of gets a bit squirrely. So a practical way of having it bound there. So it's also going to be attached to the arm in some way. So maybe it's pinned there. The French style has a little area, a little tab, which you can pin to the alb. Sometimes we use in this the example that I gave you there. This is an Italian style set, so it has a little thing that slides up underneath that holds it to the arm. Or sometimes we just use an elastic band there. There has to be a cross in the middle of it, so that's what's on top of the arm. And then there's going to be crosses on the front and the back of it, where it kind of spreads out or towards the end of it there. Okay. And I mentioned before, this is called in certain medieval texts the sudarium, so the sweat cloth. And that's really where it developed from. The clergy would carry over their arm something to wipe themselves with because they didn't want to dirty their tunic. They didn't want to dirty their alb. And then obviously it's not used for that anymore. I mean, cleaning all of that gold embroidery off with all the sweat that would get on it is not going to be fun, right. Or possible sometimes. So obviously it's more symbolic now. It's not the sudarium it used to be, but it still has this, it's still worn and it's developed into what it is today. It has to be made of silk or a similar kind of precious material. We're going to discuss that, I think, during the rules section. And it really should match all the rest of the vestments. On a practical point here, if a set of vestments that one has is missing something, it's often going to be the maniple, because these were thrown out in the 1960s. And if you need to replace that, it's often easier to replace a stole, which is hidden oftentimes by the chasuble, with fabric that's somewhat similar, and take the stole and turn it into a maniple, because you're going to see that. So just a little practical point as we're passing through here. Anyway, it has to match the vestments in color, and really it should match the whole style and look like the rest of the vestments. It's only ever worn by the subdeacon, deacon, priest, and bishop at Mass. So you'll typically see a priest even take this off sometimes to preach. It's not required, but since that's not really part of the Mass, properly speaking, he'll take this off. If he's going to, for instance, do the asparagus, he will put the maniple on after he takes off the cope. The cope and the maniple are never worn together because the cope is never worn at Mass, properly speaking. It's worn in certain ceremonies around there, but it's not during Mass. It's given to the subdeacon at his ordination, like I said. And the bishop, in fact, will put this on, but he doesn't do it at the beginning of Mass, only during the prayers at the foot of the altar. Other people put it on in the sacristy or over at their seats. Okay. There's various different styles here. The medieval is just a straight band. The French is like a spade, shovel-like ends. The Belgian German style also is straight, though it tends to flare out a little bit at the end. The Italian, as you can see, if you look back at the picture, is kind of wide, but then it flares out a little bit. But notice where the cross is, it's up where it starts to flare out, whereas the other crosses tend to be put in the middle of where it flares out or at the middle of the end.
Interesting.
So there is the maniple. Now, we'll talk about them at different times here, and I'll probably just put them together. But the tunic or the tunicle is the other vestment that's given to the subdeacon at his ordination. This is the over tunic from Greco-Roman society. It's simply a version of that's become more and more decorated. It's similar to the dalmatic. And since about the 16th century, there's really no distinction between these two, though originally it was a shorter or wider garment. As the dalmatic was a bit longer and more narrow because it came from a different place, Dalmatia. It's like a large shirt. In the picture, you can kind of see that. It comes down to the knees or about there. It has a hole on the head and sleeves that come at least about halfway down the arms. Now, those sleeves are in different places. The Gothic, Italian, Spanish styles, like you'll see in the picture there, tend to have full sleeves with the arms going all the way through them, or they are tied or clasped at the bottom. So they're proper sleeves, whereas the French and Germanic styles tend to have the bottoms completely cut away and open. So they tend to sort of just look more like flaps on the side rather than sleeves, properly speaking.
Okay.
So that's the tunicle. It's given to the subdeacon with the bishop saying, "May the Lord clothe you with the tunic of joy and the garment of rejoicing." So there's a joy aspect there. Now, interestingly enough, the first reference we get to the tunic as a liturgical garment for the subdeacon is when Pope St. Gregory the Great banned it. He wanted the subdeacon to use the chasuble instead. And this is where we get the folded chasuble or the custom of using that. But by the Middle Ages, the tunic was back and it's back in style and the subdeacon is wearing it again. And it was used in the Middle Ages for times of joy, hence the reference there. And it was taken off when it wasn't times of joy, penitential times. Since it's on the screen now, or at least we're talking about the tunicle, we might as well, though it's a little bit out of order, mention the dalmatic. And that's given to the deacon at the same point in time for his ordination. It's, as I mentioned, from Dalmatia, hence the name. It's a tunic from across the Adriatic, from over near where Serbia is now. It was introduced actually a lot earlier than the tunic as a vestment for deacons. Pope St. Sylvester in 315 writes about this, and it begins in Rome and it spreads out from there. In some places, it's even then used by the acolytes, and the East still does that. So if you see, like in Eastern liturgies, sometimes you'll see the little boys in what looks like what we would call a dalmatic or something similar to that, because all of their servers their acolytes still wear those. Now, there's no real symbolism to this vestment. It's just civil wear. But the abbot Blessed Maros Rabanus of Fulda spoke of its cruciform shape being an image of Christ's sufferings. Again, this is a little bit of an applied thing. If that helps you to understand it a bit better, and obviously it did him and his monks, great. But the prayer is, when we put it on, is, "Lord, endow me with the garment of salvation." I guess that could refer to the cross. The vestment of joy, probably not the cross. And the dalmatic of justice, may it ever encompass me. So I don't think we can say it's really truly symbolic of the cross, but if the cruciform shape of it, with the sort of the T shape to it, helps you to think of as the Franciscans' cross tends to think of the crucifixion, then wonderful.
Sure. Okay. So then going backwards a bit in order of ordination is the stole.
Right, because that has to be put underneath of the dalmatic. But since the tunic and dalmatic are really the same, and that set of vestments that you were shown there, they are exactly the same, we have the stole that goes underneath. That's actually the first vestment that the deacon receives at his ordination. And it's used by deacons, priests, and bishop as a symbol of authority. It derives from a band of cloth that magistrates and those who had an authority in the empire, the Roman Empire, would put upon themselves to show that authority, show their office. And now it shows the same thing in the church. It shows an office. So the diaconate is the first office in which one receives truly a sacrament. So the diaconate is thought to be a sacrament, whereas all of the other orders are part of the sacrament of holy orders, part of the sacrament. They receive some of the priestly power, but they're treated as sacramentals, not sacraments. So that's why, for instance, one who is only ordained as an acolyte could leave the seminary, and subdeacon makes a vow. So that's a little different thing there. But yeah, so this is the first order, which is certainly a sacrament. Some theologians think all of them are part of the sacrament and all receive a sacramental grace. That's not for us to but there's something in the argument for the stole for a deacon being something unique here, something that shows something different has happened. Okay. So it's this band of cloth that for a deacon is worn across from the left shoulder down to the right, its ends hanging over there and typically pinned. And it's a symbol of authority, but it's a symbol of a reserved authority. You only see part of it, and the other part is hidden behind you. It's over only one shoulder, for instance. Similar to, for instance, when the bishop ordains a deacon, he uses one hand, not two. So there's a passing of some power here, but there isn't a fullness of the power that's given. So with the stole for the deacon is like this, the stole for the priest is worn in front of the body. And I think there's a separate one there for the priest. Yeah. So it's a similar thing. It oftentimes is the exact same form of the stole, but it's worn for a priest in front of the body. And then it's crossed on one side over the other to show, again, a full authority, but a restricted full authority. For the bishop, and I didn't give you a picture of this because I didn't want to be accused of or start rumors about various things that might be going on in society or anything like that. I have no higher aspirations. Trust me, it's hard enough to do my job as it is. Father
Palco put it in the podcast as an Easter egg. He knows something we don't. No, he doesn't.
I know very little. I know nothing. I'm not just saying that as an Americanist or anything like that. I really know nothing. And I'm probably going to be the last one to know anyway on these things. So, yeah. As I'm just a lowly podcaster at this point in time.
Yeah, so. Right. Welcome to the club.
Case, the bishop will just wear it straight down, and he'll then bind it, as you can see in the picture. He'll bind it with the cincture. The bishop wears it right down, showing that complete authority. And whether he's wearing an alb or a rochet, he wears it the same way. It's over the shoulders. It's not around the neck. And this is actually a design problem that oftentimes vestments will have. They're not supposed to be pulled up tight against the neck. Oftentimes you will see little white cloths put on there to keep the sweat off and keep the stole from getting stained, because the stole was designed wrong. It shouldn't need to be there. And this is where sometimes in the styles of the Italians, they'll come to a point at the center because they're supposed to sit back. Sometimes on pastoral stoles, which is another version of the stole that hangs in front, it's bound in the center, used with the surplice. You'll see in Italian versions of that a little cord at the neck that keeps it from riding up onto the neck itself, so it stays on the shoulders. So it's really meant to be on the shoulders because it's the yoke of the Lord. We don't carry yokes on our necks. We carry them on our shoulders. Otherwise, if you ever do any kind of squatting or lifting, that's a bit of a problem if you try to use your neck rather than your actual shoulders. So the Gothic ones are nice and long. The Italian one you see here is fairly short. It's about 8 feet total in length. The medieval and Gothic ones tend to be really long, about 10 feet in length. Although the main way that they were typically worn is, again, not around the neck. They would be tied, they would be thrown over the shoulder far enough down where the cincture would hold them in the back. So they would be bound under the cincture in the back and then down in front as well. So they truly go over the shoulders.
Interesting.
So the yoke of the Lord, his yoke is sweet, his burden light. We are told when we are given the stole as a deacon. Obviously, it's symbolic of the Levitical office, which is why it's given to the deacon. The Levites are the deacons, and dedicated to the service of God in the temple. And so since it's Levitical, it's restricted to the deacon and above. Now, interestingly enough, the prayer when we put on the stole speaks of the restoration of innocence, which doesn't seem to talk about the yoke of the Lord at all. But it seems like maybe it's a symbol of purity, but in fact, really a symbol here, this innocence, is not a symbol of purity per se. It's a symbol of sanctifying grace. That's the whole purpose of holy orders. That's the whole purpose of the Levitical office, is to communicate grace, to give grace through the sacraments, through what we do. And so this robe of immortality, which the same prayer speaks about when we're putting this on, is spoken about as being lost in the transgression of our first parents. That's sanctifying grace, that friendship with God that's lost. And so this clothing in the stole is actually supposed to be a symbol of us being able to communicate in a certain way, sanctifying grace. That's why the priest, for instance, wears a purple stole and must wear a purple stole, unless one's not available, for absolution. He's restoring sanctifying grace to your souls if you've lost it. And so he needs to show the authority by which he has that power. And that's where the stole is used.
Right. Is it true, Father, that I was reading somewhere, and it was in a reputable book, that the crossing of the stole for a priest symbolizes also the cross, and the sacrifice of the sacrifices the priest has to make is carrying the cross with him. And since the bishop wears the pectoral cross, that is why he doesn't need to cross the stole in front. Is that just another applied symbolism thing, do you think?
I would think so. I've not read of that anywhere where it would suggest that the church is trying to show that symbolism.
Okay.
Though, I mean, that's a perfectly good way of, again, looking at these things that the church does, looking at the vestments and seeing in them something that helps us to understand a bit more about them. The difficulty, again, just as a reminder, is not in finding that symbolism, but the difficulty is maybe in searching for a symbolism as a necessity, or then trying to make theological arguments about certain things from there. Oh, well, like the priest didn't put a stole on right, or he did this, and so he's missing out on some grace. Well, yeah, he's maybe violating the rules, but so yeah, that's the only difficulty I see in applying symbolism. Is it's fine, but when we start then turning it into a vehicle by which we're going to make some kind of theological argument from it, we run into a bit of a problem.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. And then after the stole, the last thing that the priest wears for Mass is the chasuble.
The chasuble, yes. Derived again from civil attire, originally that poncho. And as we noted, St. Gregory the Great had all of his subdeacons wearing this as well. So it was only later just a priestly garment. A medieval form is going to be a very large, about 11 to 12 feet in diameter, circular garment with a hole for the head, which is very, very difficult to wear. It would be gathered up around the arms. So you see the priest, or you see me trying to hold my hands properly. And there's a reason that we're supposed to do this. It's a practical reason that we pray with our hands folded like that. And that's because with that giant conical chasuble, if your hands moved any further down, then you would be trying to sort of swim out of the tent that you've created for yourself. Yeah. So it's that's why he keeps his hands above the chest level. That's why, in fact, the whole motion by which we make that is, part of it is in order to let the chasuble fall down, if it were the full form, into the crook of the elbow there, so it would sit properly. Obviously, this is not that type of vestment that you may see on the screen. That's a Italian style. But as it began to be cut back, that's what happens to it. The arms then are be able to be visible. And again, the front is cut out. So the arms are not visible on the side, but on the front only. And so it's worn only by the priest, usually only at Mass. It's particularly a Mass garment, though in some processions with the Blessed Sacrament, where priests wear a stole to show that they're, for instance, that they are a priest. In some countries, especially in Germany, it was more common that they would wear over their surplice, they would wear the vestment of their order. So the chasuble might be worn, for instance, over a surplice just to show that this man in the procession was a priest, for instance. Notice on the back there too, oftentimes you see a cruciform pattern, but in the Italian style, that's very rare. Instead, you tend to see this column down the center and oftentimes embroidery around there. Though some Italian sets are actually are in fact much simpler than that. And notice a proper Italian set comes pretty far down. Sometimes you'll see that sort of like square back that you see in Italian sets, and it will come down only a few feet in the back. That's not proper. Sometimes some manufacturers of Italian style chasubles will do that.
Right. Especially if you're a taller priest, it's almost like the short surplice. It's the same thing. It just looks odd.
It looks very odd. There's a set that we used to use at the seminary, and I don't think I've seen it in many years. One, I've not been at the seminary. Two, when I have been at the seminary, they typically don't use that color, but I don't think they use it much anymore. It's this very lime green Italian set that in the front, were I to wear it, it would come down to almost my feet, and in the back would come down to just a little bit below my waist. So it's very disproportionate and not well designed.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about badly designed vestments later.
Fair.
All right. So I was going to show also there's some other things that we should talk about here. So with a vestment set, a low mass set is going to include the chasuble. It's going to include a stole. It's going to include the maniple, and then two other pieces, the chalice veil and the burse. The burse will carry the corporal. The chalice veil goes over the chalice. And they all ideally are in about the same kind of fabric, the same design.
Got it. Okay. And then the cope. This is not worn for mass proper.
No, it's never worn for mass proper, though it is worn sometimes at ceremonies like benediction. And if you have a subdeacon and deacon at benediction, oftentimes they'll wear the dalmatic and tunicle without the maniple because it's not mass, but the priest himself will wear the cope. It's also made of silk or precious materials, just like all of the rest of the vestments we've talked about here. It's semicircular in form, and it's quite large. It takes a lot of fabric to make one of these things. Various styles. What you're seeing, or the picture I have there, is we could probably say it's a Germanic or French style. Because of the shape of the hood. A Gothic style comes to a bit of a point, and the Italian style, the hood comes even further down the back, and usually just very plain, where the band that you see across the front of it will go the whole way across in an Italian style, and the hood is below that. The hood actually used to be a proper hood, and this is essentially an outdoor cloak that became just ornamented and nice and precious. So you'll see the priest use it when he might just be walking in from outside, like to come and start the mass or the asperges ceremony, to give this blessing to go in procession, for instance. You'll also see it if you ever go to Vespers and there is more than just one priest there. He has assistants. You'll see the assistants, like a deacon and subdeacon. At Vespers, they'll wear a cope instead of the tunic and dalmatic, unless it's a pontifical Vespers, and then that's even more complicated than that. Okay. So that's when the cope is used.
Okay.
Now, the humeral veil oftentimes will go over the cope at benediction. You'll more frequently see that. Or at solemn mass, it's put over the subdeacon when he's holding the paten, and it's used sometimes as a chalice veil at the beginning of the mass. It covers the chalice. Notice in the pictures I'm showing here, it tends to be a very wide garment. The French style, this is Italian, the French style tends to be much more narrow, but still is pretty about 2 feet or so, maybe at least 1.5 feet wide. And it's about 10 feet long. So it's a huge piece of fabric worn over the shoulders. The symbolism here, there really isn't one. It's just that things need to be veiled. Sacred things need to be veiled, and the paten is going to be used for the host. And at Mass, it's the chalice, unless it's being used immediately, is always veiled. The paten at Mass, at a solemn Mass, isn't veiled. This comes in all the various colors of the various 4 colors, in fact, that we use in the church, not 5, because black is never used. In the Dominican Rite, they do use a black humeral veil, but in the Roman Rite, at Requiem Masses where black would be used, the paten stays on the altar, and so the subdeacon, instead of holding the paten, does the incensation at the elevation. Okay. So the colors are only ever used at Mass. White is always used, no matter what the color of the vestments are, for benediction or when carrying the Blessed Sacrament. And that covers, it's the whole point in that is to actually to cover the hands of the priest, because the priest is not giving you a blessing. And so his hands should be covered. That's the symbolism there. Okay. So
And then the chalice veil on the burse we already talked about.
We did.
Next is the broad stole. I'm not super familiar with this one, Father.
No. So previous to the revisions of Holy Week in 1956, which I believe I'm going to talk about in the future, and then previous to the revision of the rubrics in 1960, on certain penitential days, the deacon, instead of wearing the tunic or the dalmatic, would instead wear a folded chasuble, which we'll talk about next, and a broad stole when he would sing the gospel or for certain actions at the altar. The broad stole actually it represents a rolled up chasuble, which you can see in the one picture on the left when I provided to you. This is the old form, and it would be the deacon it relates back to penitential days, only used during penitential days, because on the ember days, penitential days, often the deacon was ordained. And so he would carry in the chasuble, and it would be folded up, very much like now, but it would be folded up or it would be rolled up. It would be carried in different ways, like a stole here. And so when he would be ordained, this would be taken off of him, and then it would be rearranged, and the stole rearranged after he was ordained, and then it would be folded up, just like we do now, but in the front, not the back. And then it would be let down at the end of the ordination. So these symbols, because oftentimes ordination was given on those penitential ember days, has carried over and it developed into these garments. They're not used much anymore, but it's basically like a very wide stole. Though you can't see it, there is a stole under that broad stole. It's not a replacement for the stole. It's a replacement for the dalmatic or for the folded chasuble.
Okay. And then the folded chasuble, yeah.
Yeah, you see it with actually a broad stole there as well. Notice it's short in the front. This is, again, where it was started to be cut out in the front. But this was worn by the subdeacon back from St. Gregory the Great. When he insisted on this to make a distinction with the priest, oftentimes the front was folded up. And so this would be used by the subdeacon and sometimes by the deacon at certain ceremonies anterior to 1960 or 1956. In the 1960 revisions, basically the tunicle and the dalmatic replaced these for simplicity's sake. And often these were kind of hard to find. So if you wanted to do solemn ceremonies outside of here, the deacon wouldn't wear anything or except for his stole. And so there was in the simplification that was done then, these kinds of things were done away with to make the symbolism a little bit more clear, rather than hearkening back to ordinations, which most people had forgotten about.
Okay. All right. And then let's go back a few slides to look at the biretta. So you're wearing this on the slide with the chasuble.
Yes. So there's some headwear that sometimes priests wear. The biretta is this square cap with 3 horns. It's used by clerics, and for a cleric up to a priest, it's black. Remember that prelate we talked about before, the chaplain of His Holiness? He'll get a red palm on top of it. A bishop will have an amaranth or Roman purple version of this. That's that almost magenta color. A cardinal red. He never gets a palm, though, interestingly enough. And certain orders, like the Premonstrarians, use a white biretta, but the Pope doesn't use a biretta, so he never wears white. The only reason I included it in here is, one, you see it sometimes, and the rubrics instruct or at least presume that the sacred ministers at least are going to be wearing this at various points in time, though it doesn't seem to be of obligation anymore. And you'll find in some society circles that it's worn, and other societies places it's kind of disfavored. And usually the reason for this was certain priests, seminarians, or faithful started making a bit of a ruckus as to it being worn or it not being worn, because it's not a commonly used thing in France, for instance. And so when French priests would come over, they wouldn't wear it. They didn't want to wear it. And the faithful were just not going to use it anymore. And that happened even at the seminary. There was a bit of a controversy over people insisting that we wear it. And so it was determined when they decided to make a little bit of a rebellion against it, we're just not going to use it because we're not going to The same reason why we don't wear, as society priests, we don't wear fringe on on the sash that we have. It's, again, you don't want to be ostentatious, and so there's also, I don't have a picture of it, a zucchetto, which oftentimes would go underneath of that. You see it more on a bishop, though there is a version for a priest. It's rarely worn. We're not allowed to wear it during any mass. We don't put it on or take it off during mass, though the bishop does. For a bishop, it's purple. For a cardinal, it's red. For the pope, white. And the reason for that is formerly, when we're tonsured, we had to keep a small area of the top of our head bare. For some of us, that's a little easier than others because it just kind of naturally happens that way. But it kind of gets cold. And so this was a cap to cover that bald spot.
Got it. Okay. Let's go up a rank or two. We've got the Episcopal garments. Again, some distinctive things here.
Yes. So you notice that this bishop here is wearing other things beyond just a chasuble and his alb and various other things. He's not wearing gloves, which we'll talk about, and those are in another slide, but he is wearing a mitre. These come in three varieties. There is a silk version of it that is oftentimes very heavily decorated. This is what you see, I believe, in this picture. What's interesting about this is it's called the precious mitre. It's decorated with jewels and various embroideries. There is a simpler version called the golden mitre, which is just cloth of gold. And that's oftentimes used for when he's sitting for longer periods in time, and it might be very heavy. Some of these precious mitres were very heavy back in the day. And then there is a simple mitre, which is just a white linen cloth, or for cardinals, it's of a white damask cloth, white silk cloth. This symbolizes his authority, and all bishops are allowed to use the mitre. At certain points, he may not even use the crozier, but he may, in fact, use the mitre. And he's also, you notice, wearing something underneath of his chasuble that no one else seems to be wearing, or at least maybe two people seem to be wearing. So what's interesting about that is this is what we call a tunicella. It's a tunic and a dolmanic which are sewn together as one piece. So when a bishop is doing pontifical functions in a solemn way, he wears this to show the completeness of all of the orders that he has received. So he wears both the tunic, the dolmanic, and the chasuble, as well as all of his particularly pontifical garments. Just as an aside here, notice in the picture the priest on the left, or the bishop's right, but the left in the picture. This would be a monsignor, a prelate, and you notice that he is wearing a rochet and he is also wearing a beretta with that purple tuft, but it's a black beretta otherwise. And he's wearing what looks like a bishop's cassock, though he's not a bishop. So he's a prelate. Whereas on the other side, you see that the gentleman, the priest there, is wearing a surplice with wider sleeves and none of the other things, and just a black beretta. So these are assistant deacons at the throne who would be assisting this bishop. So just a little aside there.
Yeah, interesting.
There are also gloves. These are from our sacristy. So this is what a bishop would wear. He wears this when he's seated at his throne. He wears these when he's processing in and carrying his crozier, and he's wearing these at ordinations as well. They come in all of the various colors except black. Violet is used in place of black. Okay. And then rarely seen in the society, because our bishops tend not to use these, are buskins, which are special liturgical socks, and sandals of the liturgical color. Many bishops just wear white shoes with these, and they don't change the color of them. But these are oftentimes used in other circles, and they come in all the liturgical colors as well, except for black. Black is never worn, and violet is worn instead. Okay. And then finally, the Episcopal vestment that you may see more often is the gremial, because this is put out, for instance, for confirmations. Oftentimes in that case, it's linen and not this nice fabric. It's a large lap cloth that's meant to help protect the vestments. So when the bishop is seated, he puts this down. And then also, for instance, for ceremonies like at the altar, for instance, ordinations or confirmations, because we may have the spilling of certain things, hair in the case of tonsure, or in the case of confirmation, maybe a drip of the sacred oil, the sacred chrism. system that goes on the head. Usually a linen piece is there so it can be purified, whereas nice silk vestments a little harder to wash. Okay. So that is the gremial.
So then we'll get into the altar linens, or the altar quote unquote vestments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on top of the altar, actually in the picture here, we'll want to go to the antependium.
Okay.
That's
here we go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the altar vestments here, underneath of the vesperale cloth, which I've not named there, that's the cloth that goes on top that keeps the dust off of the altar, are a number of altar cloths. So there will be at least 3 of those. The 2 underneath are supposed to be the size of the altar, although you can make it double the length and fold it over. And then the top one is supposed to come all the way down to the floor on the sides there. Sometimes you'll see lace in the front. That's allowed. But obviously, it doesn't work very well with an antependium, which is what you see in front here. The antependium is a large cloth made from a vestment type material that is clothing the altar, because the altar is a symbol of our Lord. It's used for Mass, Vespers, Benediction. It's supposed to be the color of the tabernacle veil, the color of the liturgical day, although while the tabernacle veil is never black, it's always most violet. The antependium can be black instead. Antependium means hangs before, and that's precisely what it's doing here on this altar. And it's supposed to help to, again, beautify the altar for the great feasts. While it really should be on at any Mass, at least on first-class feasts where the altar itself is more plain than anything else, it should be used. What's interesting is it can be made of wood or gold. Sometimes you see actually like a gilded leather that's used instead. Some beautiful, beautiful things here. And if you ever go to St. Peter's Basilica and you go in when there's not some kind of liturgy going on at the main altar, you won't see the main altar look very nice. It's just a block of marble. And then you look at a ceremony and it's really beautifully covered with this, antependium. And that's precisely what's going on here. Now, the tabernacle veil you'll see there as well. And there's different colors of the tabernacle veil. But notice in switching over to the bare altar there, how distinct that is. There's that drama, right? The stripping of the altars on Holy Thursday. Imagine if beforehand you saw that beautiful antependium and then all of a sudden it's all gone. Right. Yeah. It really, brings home the stripping of that altar. Whereas if it were just plain as it is now and all the time plain, there's not much of a distinction. Maybe you could throw some lace or some things falling down the front, but, etc. But notice in the tabernacle veil, it switched colors. The tabernacle veil should be of the color of the office of the day. So the one picture was from the Annunciation. The other one was from today. And today is a Feria in Lent, so that's why it's violet. The tabernacle veil really should go the whole way around the tabernacle, and a tabernacle really should be constructed in such a way that it can have this happen to it. It can be completely surrounded. Tabernacle means tent, and so it should be really a house for our Lord that's like a tent, and the tabernacle veil should be like that. As a result, sometimes we only get these little curtains in the front. That's unfortunate, but that's sometimes how a tabernacle is constructed, which is more saying something about the construction of altars not always being what they ought to be. Now, sometimes you'll see the Mass of the day and the tabernacle veil not match, because for a sung Mass, a votive Mass or commemoration, it should match the color of the day. But the Church has said that for just a private Mass or a low Mass at the altar, it doesn't necessarily need to. And sometimes you'll see that it changes for benediction to white. The only restriction that we have here is it cannot be lace. You cannot see through. It's supposed to be a veil. It's not a veil for a bride. It's a veil for our Lord, and it should be the nicest kind of things and not lacy.
Got it. Okay.
So there you go. There's the antependium, sometimes left out, the tabernacle veil, and the altar cloths. And those altar cloths, again, must always be of linen or hemp.
Okay.
And then we go to the altar linens. And this is sort of the last little bit here before I think probably a good place to end what is already looking like a very long episode, but at least we'll get all of this in and we can pick up with some other symbolism and some rules after that.
Okay.
We have the purificator. That's in the back in this picture. It's folded into thirds. It's a rectangular cloth of linen or hemp. Other materials are not allowed. It's about 16 inches by 10 inches, though sometimes a little bit bigger, sometimes a little bit smaller. You fold it in half lengthwise, and this gets placed on the chalice. You'll see to the left of that, there is a chalice set up, and hanging from it is a purificator. It goes across the chalice, and then the paten is put on top with the host on top of that, and then a pall. It's used to dry the chalice. It's used to pick up any particles of the host or of the precious or drips of the precious blood. Or if we spill, we drop a host, we'll use this to wipe up any crumbs that might be there with some water. And so because it can have remnants of the Blessed Sacrament contained within it, it might have that. It shouldn't if the priest is doing his job correctly. But it might. We do have to be careful. And so a subdeacon has to wash this before anybody else is allowed to touch it. You'll also see on there in the front a corporal. That's a heavily starched square cloth of linen. It has to be linen or hemp. It's about 20 inches by 20 inches, give or take, some smaller, some larger. It should be sufficiently large here. It's folded in thirds and then in thirds again. So it forms 9 little squares here. It's symbolic of the burial shroud in which our Lord was buried. And so it will have the host itself after the consecration put on directly on it. So it's clearly a sacrifice and not a meal. The paten in a normal mass is either held by the subdeacon or hidden underneath of the corporal. So it's clearly not a plate. So it's not a meal. One of the changes in the Novus Ordo Mass, now it's the host is always on the plate because it's more like a meal. Anyway, symbolic of the burial shroud. Now, sometimes you will see this put out underneath relics of the true cross. That is not correct. It's only ever used for the Blessed Sacrament. And sometimes people will put it out under like a little statue of our Lord or like in the crib. Yeah, that's also not correct. It's for the Blessed Sacrament alone, not statues, not relics. There is always one of these in, usually round shape, in the tabernacle. It's because the ciborium always sits on top of one when it has consecrated hosts in it. It's folded up into these in thirds and thirds, and then it's put inside of the burse when it's carried. And that burse always sits flat when it has a corporal in it, and it always stands up when it does not, to show it there. And then benediction, it's put out to be under the monstrance, and those are typically with a cross not on the front, but a cross in the middle to make them distinct, because since the Blessed Sacrament never actually touches it, it doesn't have to be laundered or washed by a subdeacon.
Okay.
But because because in a regular corporal, there's almost certainly going to be a little particle here or two of the sacred body of our Lord. Always the subdeacon must wash this, and he must wash it separately from the purificators in warm water before he can hand it over to somebody else to launder properly.
Okay.
Not shown here is the maniturgium, or the finger towel. You'll see those it's usually about 12 inches by 12 inches, folded typically either in thirds or in quarters. And that has a small cross in the corner. And this is usually used by the priest when he washes his fingers at Mass. And then finally, in that picture, in the middle and on top of the chalice, you'll see 3 different versions of a pall, a square piece of linen about 6 inches square, usually supported by some card. Binder's board, if you're making one of these, binder's board or craft board is one of the best materials. It's like a really heavy paper. It's all kind of bound together. It has a flex to it, but it also is, it wears pretty well. And you can sand the edges and it's not sharp, etc. And it's nice and stiff, but it's also a little flexible. It can have embroidery or painting on the top. On the one that's on the chalice, there's some painting by one of the Society sisters who made that for me. It's beautiful, and it's painted onto silk. And then there's some nice things around it, but that silk isn't the right material for this. It has to be linen. So on the underside, usually there's a square of linen that is sewn up into there so it can be taken out and washed if it needs to be. If it's part of the pall and the card can't come out, washing it becomes a bit of a nightmare. You have to take it apart and then put it back together and not fun. So
Yeah.
this is actually a late development, though. This comes from where the corporal used to be much larger, and it would be folded back over the chalice to protect it during the Mass. Then they started using an extra corporal once they became smaller and just put it on top, and then it turned into a card that was going on top as well.
Interesting. Okay. So, yeah, I think this is a good spot for us to break for this week, going through all of these different things. And then next week, we'll talk about colors of the vestments and some more rules and regulations, right?
And we get a little practical, because obviously we want to have people be able to beautify their churches. That's one of the reasons we're even talking about art, not just to explain, but to help people to have these good things in their churches. So maybe some practical points about where to find good vestments, where not to find good vestments, or where not to find bad vestments, and maybe some tips about even caring for them as well.
Fantastic. Father, looking forward to it. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.